Hi, so this morning we're going to chat around China and some of the developments that have been unfolding. There are a couple of issues that I think are impacting the Chinese economy, and it's becoming a little bit complex to analyze. There are many different components that are all impacting, and I guess where it results in some sort of confusion is what's behind all of these factors and where does it leave China in terms of overall economic growth. So we're going to discuss this idea of a common prosperity agenda. I think that's a key element of it. We're going to discuss the Evergrande issue, the property developer. I think that's also a key issue. But before we get to those two key issues, there are a couple of other factors that I think we need to be aware of that is impacting China. The first is the way they manage the COVID outbreaks. Now, when you look at the number of COVID infections in China, they remain exceptionally low. I can't remember recently a day where they had more than 100 new infections. They typically would have maybe 10 or 15 infections, maybe 30, 50 at times. And so when you compare those in numbers of infections to what's happening globally, they seem insignificant. In addition, China is successfully rolling out their own vaccine. That vaccine is the least efficient of all of the vaccines that are available globally, but nevertheless, they're rolling out their vaccine, and they have provided the vaccine to a significant percentage of the population. So what's the COVID issue? The COVID issue is that as soon as there's a small outbreak of COVID, the Chinese authorities react very aggressively to that outbreak, and therefore they implement very strict regulation or controls, even for one or two cases. So let me give you an example. Earlier this year, I think it's the second busiest container port in the world. So China has a number of big shipping ports, and they have by far the biggest container ports in the world. But in the second biggest container port, they had an outbreak of one COVID infection, one person. And as a consequence of that one infection, they shut down a significant portion of the container port. They closed roads, they closed railway links, and you can imagine the disruption that caused, both to the port and to businesses associated with the port. But that's the type of reaction that's going on. And so while the infection numbers remain very low by international standards, Chinese authorities implement very harsh restrictions as soon as they have a mini outbreak in order to try and control that. And that is ongoing, and it definitely impacted their economy in August. The data reflects that. We also think that it's impacting their economy in September. And so the economic data or the growth rates have undoubtedly slowed as a consequence of these COVID outbreaks, which they pretty much overreact to. The second factor is obviously this global semiconductor shortage. Now, China isn't really at the heart of that. In other words, the shortage emanates from other countries like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea, where they manufacture semiconductors. But obviously, China being a major producer of a lot of electronic goods and a lot of motor vehicles, they are definitely impacted by the semiconductor shortage. And as a consequence, production has generally been a bit sluggish around those sectors, as it has been in other countries. So it's not unique to China, but it's aggravating their overall economic performance, and it's something that you've got to factor in. The third issue that has come up in China is that they have been under enormous pressure now for quite some time around carbon emissions. And obviously, when you do the testing of pollution around the world and general environmental conditions, China fares incredibly badly. And over time, more and more pressure has emerged on the Chinese authorities to do something about these high carbon emissions. And so they've systematically been giving into that pressure, and they're trying to make changes. And this year, they have implemented a number of significant changes. And part of that has included a scaling down of production in industries that are big polluters. So which industries are affected? Certainly steel production under pressure. They've forced a number of factories to close or to scale down production in order to reduce pollution. They've done the same for cement, and they've also done that for aluminium production. And clearly, those are areas that China would have a significant output in. And because they're scaling back that production, it is also impacting their economy. And alongside that, they have also started to scale back some of their electricity production. And so there are a number of towns where they have quite extensive electricity outages, not because they don't have the ability to produce electricity. So it's not a South African type situation. They could produce the electricity, but they're closing down the electricity production in order to reduce carbon emissions, and they're trying to effect significant change to the environment. Obviously, what that does, though, is it massively disrupts industrial production, economic output, and it's putting additional pressure on the economy. So right at the outset, you've got three factors during the course of this year that are working against the performance of the Chinese economy. Some of them are pretty much global. So the COVID-19 is happening everywhere, semiconductor shortage, that's happening everywhere. The carbon emission is more specifically China. But those are a number of headwinds that the Chinese economy is trying to deal with. Then on top of that, you add two very specific areas. The one is this common prosperity agenda. Now, what does that really mean? What it means is, think of it as a very strong determination to improve income and wealth inequality. So China, in their progression and in their rapid growth, they've created a huge amount of wealth. But like every other country, that wealth is concentrated in the hands of very few. And so a lot of people in China have got overall much better off. China is a upper middle income country, but there's a significant, I guess, section of the population that is enjoying extreme prosperity, millionaires, billionaires, and living a very, very luxurious lifestyle. And some of that is spilling over into property prices, into how business is being conducted, things like gambling, all kinds, luxury shopping, all kinds of things have come about and flourished because of the emergence of a small but still significant number of very rich individuals. Now, China, at the heart of it, remains a communist environment, and the idea of income inequality is not acceptable within that environment, and that remains a very strong agenda. And what seems to be happening at the moment is China is trying to implement a number of regulatory changes in order to even the playing field, in order to make the system more equitable. And what that means, in effect, is that they are dampening down the excesses. So things like gambling comes under pressure. But other things are also being done that is more of a cultural nature. So it's not just inequality, it's got to do with refreshing the culture of the country. And part of that has to do with education and not wanting online education, wanting everybody to go to a physical school and not have an elite of people being educated online in a different education system. Part of it relates to young people spending too much time playing computer games and wanting people to not do that, but rather young people to get involved in other types of activities. So there's a cultural element to the common prosperity, and there's a income and wealth inequality element to this. And these changes are very substantial, and obviously we've read about quite a few of them, but what they're doing is they are reshaping industry as a consequence. Now, one of the things that comes up in this discussion is why do this now? And if you go back to a statement that was issued by the Communist Party in April, they kind of explained why they're doing this now. And the statement says, at a time when there is less pressure to maintain steady growth, effort should be made to advance solid and sound economic development, deepen supply-side structural reform, and remove the impediments to domestic and international circulations. And what they essentially are saying is, because of this COVID world, because of the disruptions to industries, including semiconductors, this is a good opportunity to effect other reforms because the economy is going to be disrupted anyway. And so we might as well use this opportunity to implement a range of reforms. And those range of reforms can be environmental reform to improve carbon emissions. And some of those reforms relate to this common prosperity and culture. And so you've seen a whole lot of stuff come together that has been worked on in the background, but hasn't been implemented. And the Chinese authorities are using this environment of COVID and the natural disruption that COVID brings to the world economy to effect other changes, which says that they hope that these changes will be implemented over a period of months into next year, but it's not anticipated that these changes will become more and more draconian, or that they will become more and more extensive and therefore create a bigger and bigger disruption. That's not the thought. The thought is you're trying to rebalance the Chinese economy, you're trying to implement some regulatory changes, and then you're going to try and make sure those are being adhered to. But once they adhere to, then your system should be in a kind of more stable environment. So last week we saw the Chinese authorities ban all cryptocurrencies. Now, previously they banned Bitcoin. Now they've gone and banned all cryptocurrencies, and that ban is a very strict ban. You can be imprisoned just for providing pricing data on cryptocurrencies. Again, that's essentially a cultural reform. They don't want currencies being developed outside of the monetary system. And the Chinese central bank wants to put forward their own digital currency. So there's a range of these things, and they haven't all been implemented. They're in the process of being implemented. I do expect other reforms to be announced over the coming weeks and coming months, but then it should settle down. So why do I think it will settle down? Is because next year they've got the 20th Party Congress in October next year. So the Communist Party has a big kind of meeting where they elect the leadership, including the premier of China, and they will start to gear up for that during the remainder of this year, and then obviously into next year. And obviously the current leadership wants to show that they're able to implement these types of reform measures to put themselves in a good position to be re-elected as the leaders of the Communist Party in October next year. So there's definitely a political element to these reforms. There's a cultural element. There's an ideological element in terms of the Communist Party. And there's an opportunistic element because you're doing it at a time when the economy is disrupted anyway. But it leaves us with quite a lot to kind of grapple with to understand where China is going in the short term. And then, as if that wasn't enough, you've got the Evergrande issue. Now, the Evergrande issue doesn't relate to any of this in any particular way, but it's been building up over time. And there are other property developers that are also in difficulty. It's not as if Evergrande is the only property developer. There are many others, but Evergrande represents the kind of pinnacle of the problem. It's a very, very substantial property developer. It's big by Chinese standards, which means it's huge by global standards. It employs, or did employ, over 200,000 people around the country. At one point, it was undertaking more than 800 separate construction initiatives. So think of it as building more than 800 office parks or shopping centers or whatever you're building. That's a huge amount of activity. But unfortunately, Evergrande was getting themselves into a position where they were overdeveloping. They were unable to sell all of the property that they did develop. And in order to keep the development going, they became more and more indebted. And they got to the point where they were simply borrowing more money to pay off previous debt in order to keep the whole process going. And it was clear, or it started to become clear, that this is not a sustainable business model. And what happened then was that the Chinese authorities implement regulatory changes that stopped Evergrande from being able to borrow additional funds without having their core business under control. And by implementing that regulatory reform, it suddenly became apparently clear that Evergrande is not a sustainable business because they couldn't borrow more money to deal with borrowings that fell due. And so on the face of it, if you look at the financials of Evergrande, they are bankrupt. Now, you enter into another whole difficulty, and that difficulty is an argument around the too big to fail, because the amount of debt in Evergrande represents more or less 2% of the Chinese GDP, which is enormous. So the Chinese authorities have a dilemma here. Do they allow Evergrande to fail and go out of business and accept the consequences of that? Or do they provide some safety support for Evergrande and allow the business to keep functioning? Both of those decisions have significant fallout consequences. If they allow the business to fail, then obviously a huge number of people who have invested in property and are waiting for their property to be completed and have put a lot of money into that development are going to lose their money. They're going to have invested their life savings in a property and end up with no asset. And that's disastrous given the size of Evergrande. So allowing the business to fail has problems that are social in nature and that are potentially far-reaching. If you, however, support Evergrande and keep them in business, then you are endorsing bad business practices. And there's no doubt that a select number of people in Evergrande have become extremely rich as a consequence of the way in which they conducted business. And so the criticism would be, well, you're simply helping the rich to keep their money, and therefore you are not serious about the common prosperity agenda. And so the authorities are going to have to deal with that. We don't know how they're going to try and resolve that. They haven't really given a clear indication. And I don't think they're going to rush to do that. I think they will stand on the sideline and see how this thing develops, but potentially they will get pulled into the discussion in order to stop it becoming more disruptive. So could Evergrande become the Lehman Brothers for China? Our view is no. While it's a very big business with a lot of debt, that debt is spread fairly widely, and that a lot of the debt there is some of the debt in the hands of the banks. And we know that the banks effectively are controlled by the government. And so I think the fallout from that perspective can be contained. Yes, there are obviously international investors, and there is a potential of a loss of investment from that perspective. But I'm not convinced that this is going to be a massively disruptive and highly contagious collapse were it to go out of business. Where we are perhaps a little bit more concerned is that already there is evidence that by people being anxious about Evergrande and what that means for the property sector, people are holding back from purchasing property from other property developers. And that also has the potential to slow down economic activity and just unwind the very high pricing that is already in the property market, but also scale down construction activity. So to me, this is very much unfolding, and we've got to see how it develops further. In terms of their debt payment, they've got a huge number of coupon payments that fall due over the coming months. So on the screen, I've got firstly the dollar bonds that they have coupon payments on. And if you look at the middle column, that tells you when the coupon payment is due. The most recent one was on the 23rd of September, and we know that they missed that coupon payment, $83 million. They simply missed it. They didn't pay it. And that has already caused anxiety. Technically, they have 30 days to pay that coupon before they are in default. So we'll monitor that to see whether they can find a way to make that payment. But already in terms of these coupon payments, they're under pressure. And then if you look at the list, they've got another payment in a couple of days' time, a couple in October, November, January, all of them very substantial. And then in addition, they've got some coupon payments that are local currency payments that they have to also make. So there's no doubt that this thing is going to have to be resolved. It's not something you can simply completely ignore, because as these coupon payments roll on, they either are going to not be able to make them, or they're going to have to come up with some sort of deal either with government or with some investors. In the meantime, the nervousness around China is likely to persist. What the authorities are doing is they are injecting more liquidity into the financial system. They do that by means of what's called reverse repos or reverse repurchase agreements. And it's a way of the central bank injecting money into the financial system. And the chart is daily data, and they've increased that liquidity to about 120 billion yuan a day. Now, that is a lot more than they've been injecting recently. But if you look at the chart going back, they've done a lot more liquidity injection historically. And the Central Bank of China uses this mechanism a lot to deal with any disruption that's going on in the economy. But at least they are responding, and the expectation is if more anxiety builds up around Evergrande, the central bank, I think, will be willing to inject additional liquidity in order to allay people's concerns. The last thing just to highlight is that as China deals with these reforms and gets these factors implemented, the net result is that you do expect that the growth rate on China is systematically maturing. Their population growth rate is not what it used to be. They're starting to have a demographic problem. The economy is now well developed. There isn't the same need to develop infrastructure. There isn't the same need to create the numbers of jobs they did previously. And so you're seeing signs of a maturing emerging market. And I've got no doubt in time they'll be referred to as a developed economy. But along with that is a slowdown, a natural slowdown in the rate of growth. It shouldn't be a collapse in the growth rate. It should be a moderation over time that gets fairly well managed. But the idea that China is maturing and that their growth rate will slow, I think that's fairly clear. Of course, that has got implications for the rest of the world. It's got implications for commodity demand. It's got implications for overall economic growth in the world. And we clearly would hope that this moderation in growth is done in a very gradual way, and that it doesn't become too disruptive. And I think that's a fair conclusion at this stage. What we've got to be aware of, though, is that the changes that the authorities are implementing during the course of this year are very substantial. They'll persist. They'll probably still have a significant effect next year. And then hopefully by the time we approach the Communist Party Congress towards the end of next year, China has a new way of doing business that we can better understand. The Evergrande issue has not been finalized. It's going to remain an overhang. It's starting to impact emerging markets and cause some concerns around commodity prices. And I think we need to stay on top of that, because I think it can still be disruptive over the coming weeks and coming months. Hope that provided some insight. Thanks a lot.